All right, well, welcome to our discussion of the Federalist Papers here. We have begun with the first 11 papers, and just to start off, my name is Scott Kistler. I'm a professor of history. Mr. DePasquale is professor of history and political science as well, and Mr. Ken West is a professor of philosophy, and we'll be talking about these over the course of the next few months, and we also have some students who joined us as well. So, and our president, Dr. Avendano, is off camera, but still here. You'll have to trust us on that.
So if we're not here next week, you'll know. We've been canceled already. Remember, it took Cheers about a year to catch on. It went for 11 years, so.
Didn't they go to a new network though at some point?
No, it stayed on NBC. But they believed in it, they stuck with it, and nobody else could watch.
Well, all right, so the first 11 Federalist Papers, the biggest theme throughout them is the benefits of unity. Of course, these were written to encourage New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution in their special ratifying convention. Federalist Paper 1 is just an introduction to it, to the series by Alexander Hamilton. Says how he's going to be pursuing this, lays it out there as I'm for the ratification of the Constitution, and that's how we're going to proceed from there. And then we have some papers 2, 3, and 4, and 5 that discuss the importance of remaining united for the sake of repelling foreign influence and having the United States as a strong nation. So that's a major theme as well, as how to repel. And they talk a lot about the causes of war and everything in those. And then the next ones are we're looking at here the dangers from dissensions between the states and hostilities between the states and faction and insurrection. So how will you handle the fact that not every state's always going to be on the same page, and how we handle the even the factions and political disagreements between the states. And then Federalist Paper number 11 at the end talks about how a united nation can be commercially stronger, and then also have a navy. And it ends with kind of an interesting rallying cry for the United States of America to lead the defense of the Western Hemisphere's honor in the face of those arrogant Europeans who just think they're better than everybody else. And that was a kind of surprising end, that the United States would sort of take up the honor of an entire hemisphere and say, Europeans, you can't boss everybody around. So something I wasn't expecting, and wonder how that went over. But what we thought we'd talk about first is the background of this. Of course, is there's the Articles of Confederation, and that was not satisfactory to a lot of people. And Mr. DePasquale teaches the American history classes here, and I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about what was going on with the Articles of Confederation, why there were people not happy with it. Of course, others jump in too.
Yeah. In 1776, we declared our independence, and in our Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson gave the said the famous words that we're all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, for me, it becomes, how do we get to that? How do we ensure that everyone gets to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Our first federal government, our first Constitution, was ratified in 1777 by the Confederation Congress. They called it the Articles of Confederation. It was designed to essentially create a league of friendship between 13 independent states. They wanted to be 13 independent states with just kind of some overlapping agreements and some overlapping powers with a very weak national government, which they had feared because of Great Britain. Now, before we get into the defects of the Articles of Confederation, which lead to the new Constitution, it's important to point out that a lot of good things happened under the Articles of Confederation. The country built an effective army and navy that won our independence. They established foreign alliances, most notably with France. They established a postal system, still with us today, slugging along, but it's still there. And it laid the foundation for nationalism. But the bad clearly and soon outweighed the good. The country could not pay off its debt from the Revolutionary War. The country, the states had borrowed a lot of money. They were not getting this paid off. Okay? There was difficulty with internal and external trade. All 13 states were working in their own self-interest when it came to trade. And there were a lot of people alive at this time that were thinking of creating this national market where we traded with each other and we cooperated with each other, but it was difficult to do if Pennsylvania was charging New York a tariff to send its goods to South Carolina. States were printing their own money. The solution to getting out of debt was, well, we'll just print pieces of paper to pay off. Well, that causes huge inflation. Huge. I mean, 146% inflation. Some people just thought, hey, we'll just print money and it won't be a big problem. Okay? One of the reasons, or one of the big ways to make money at this time was Western land speculation. A weak national government was hurting that because states were out there agitating the Native Americans. Settlers were out there agitating the Native Americans. So the idea of going out west and setting up your own farm, which was a big American dream, was almost impossible to do because there was so much violence out on the frontier, and a weak national government could not do anything with that. There was civil disorder over the collection of taxes. Some states wanted to try to pay off their debt from the Revolution by imposing taxes to do so, and many people rebelled against that, the most famous being Shays' Rebellion, which led Ben Franklin to say that in 1776, Americans feared an excess of power in the rulers. Now they faced a defect of obedience in the subjects. And many people became very worried that this whole thing was just going to come unglued, that we would end up 13 independent countries all going their own way, or perhaps 3 or 4 regional confederacies. And in a lot of the Federalist Papers, they talk about how we could end up essentially at war with ourselves all the time, like Europe. So that led to the Constitutional Convention, in which a new constitution was written, and it was agreed that the Constitution had to be ratified by the people. That this was going to be the people's government, so every state was to call a convention, elect representatives to those conventions to ratify the new Constitution. Well, 9 states ratified pretty quickly. And our founders said once 9 states ratified, this is a government. But 4 states were still outside of the Union. And the most important of those 4 was New York. The governor of New York opposed this new constitution. This new constitution was creating a very powerful government that people didn't want, people didn't trust, felt that it would infringe upon their liberty, and New York could just operate as an independent country. And the founders knew they had to have New York. It was just so important that New York be a part of this new union that John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison began to write a series of essays in New York newspapers to convince New Yorkers to ratify this new constitution and join the Union. And to this day, they're still considered the quintessential documents to understanding what our founders felt about government and what kind of nation they wanted to create. And what they tried to do in writing this new constitution is basically remind people of the problems they were having under the Articles of Confederation, and they're almost predicting what will happen if we don't ratify the Constitution. So there are 85 in total, and over the next several weeks we'll get through them all.
I found it interesting that in Federalist Paper number 2, John Jay was writing about where the articles came from, and he said that this was at a time of war when they'd been written, and they left the progress of hostility and desolation left little room for those calm and mature inquiries and reflections which must ever precede the formation of a wise and well-balanced government for a free people. So, and then it's not to be wondered that at a government, it is not to be wondered at, excuse me, that a government instituted in time so inauspicious should on experiment be found greatly deficient and inadequate to the purpose it was intended to answer. So it's sort of like, it's no wonder the articles are inadequate, because this was done at a time of war, and now we've got time to really think about it. We had guys that were really intelligent, some of the cream of the crop of the American culture at the time. They really kind of did get to ask these questions, he felt, and now it's the process of defending that. So it's interesting to see sort of how they perceive the problems of it here.
Right, and they answer a lot of criticisms of a lot of the people who opposed this were called anti-federalists, and they didn't think that a republic could work, and they kept pointing to failed governments. And Hamilton, in one of the Federalist papers, says, hey, we've learned from our mistakes. So they all kind of thought, hey, we tried this, we had this form for a while, and it's not what we need today, so we need to change it. That's part of progress. One of the things that really struck me was how they so distrusted human nature. I mean, they just had such a negative view and the ability of people to really kind of govern themselves. And I always find it very fascinating that the people who were going to govern under this Constitution wrote this Constitution and didn't even trust themselves.
Yeah.
When yet they said to themselves, hey, we're the best people to write this, but yet, given human nature, we better safeguard even against ourselves. And that I just always find that so fascinating that they had that foresight to say, we can't even trust ourselves. So we have to clearly limit our powers of government.
Yeah, one of the big things we keep talking about, the relationship with foreign states and everything, or even, because obviously one of the proposals on the table was to have 3 or 4 different confederacies from the 13 American colonies, is that countries that border each other go to war. That's just an assumption. Like human nature leads to war. The more possibilities, or the more actors there are, the more possibilities there are for collision. The more borders there are, the more possibilities there are for conquest and dispute. And so, if we divide up, we're going to fight each other. We're going to be easier for other countries to exploit because the French are going to ally with one section of our country, the British are going to ally with another section of our country. We're going to be just pawns in the European schemes for power in the New World. And it was very interesting to think about that. They just thought that was the way things were, and that was the way things would be. As teaching Western Civ classes here, it's interesting just to see how grounded they were in history, and especially the classics. All educated people at this time had classical education. They knew the history of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and they believed that was what taught them about human nature, is that you can see these things stretching all the way back. And it's something that's not as, barely emphasized, in our current educational system, but this was a common reference point I think they had from reading Plutarch's Lives and Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, all sorts of things. That there was, for their audience, which was probably quite educated as well, but there was these common reference points that they could point out, that there was a sense of human nature has been constant throughout history, and this is kind of how it goes. And using also the language of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu's arguments about republics, all that kind of thing. And so, does anybody else have noticed how they use history in here?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. I mean, I think it's interesting that they kind of talk about, like you're saying, it need to have one country of Americans, because they were basically hemmed in by the British, the French, and the Spanish on 3 sides, with water on the other. So basically, you're already surrounded with nowhere to go, so you might. But also, like you're saying, with the knowledge of history, I think part of their kind of worries about human nature and man always wanting to go to wars, because a lot of these surviving records and documents that we have from ancient history are due to wars being fought between various people, and either survivors or people who were conquered or whatever, writing down their thoughts and all of that. So I think maybe if there were some more of like the kind of day-to-day things from ancient history, maybe they would have had a little different view.
I have a report to that too, where in the second one that I was reading by John Jay, he talks a lot about state and then nation. So he talks about, the geographical, we need to be a unified state, but we also need to be a nation where we all kind of assume this new, brand new identity together. So there's two different kinds of unions happening at once.
Yeah, and he like referenced providence. Like I think that was his way of saying God intended for this, intended for us to be one nation. We're of a similar background in culture and religion and language. So those are those early arguments for nationalism, which is a very new idea at this time.
It's kind of like we were all the misfits someplace else, so maybe this was supposed to be our little island where we could rule.
Oh yeah.
And it's also interesting that there was still a lot of resistance because that sounds pretty appealing. Like we're all misfits, let's go live our own, together, our own lifestyle, and there was still a lot of resistance, even though, like you were talking about, you can learn so much from your mistakes. Why would you want to flee something like Europe where it's very, close together, everybody's fighting all the time, there's all these rulers, you don't have any power. Why would you kind of resist the democracy and the unification when there's so many benefits to it?
All the examples of, the various states on one continent just doing nothing but constant warfare. And that was just always in the back of American leaders' minds. That was a lot of what drove the Manifest Destiny movement, is that, we can't have a continent with Native Americans and Mexicans and us because we will be at constant warfare. It needs to be unified under one common culture, one common ideal. So the politicians of the time clearly kept looking to Europe as their example of how not to be a continent.
Yeah, it's interesting. They said if we unite under the Constitution, we'll be England, we'll be Great Britain. If we stay disunited, we'll be continental Europe. And they fight each other all the time, and they have to have absolute governance in order to provide for security, whereas England is removed from that and therefore can be free.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting, like what he was saying, where, why wouldn't you want to do it? But I think part of it, too, is when you're afraid of what might happen when you're trying something that nobody's ever done before, you want to fall back on something even if it doesn't work, because you at least understand it.
Yeah.
Especially because you're still on your own. There was us and then the Indians who probably weren't help us if we needed anything. And you're right, if you fail it, it's kind of like, what do we do now? So I can see that.
And the possibility that this government would turn into a despotic government was on a lot of the anti-federalist mind. You consolidate this thing, we're just getting the king back again. You read some of the anti-federalist papers, that's what they're saying. Sure, I remember reading one was, sure, George Washington can be trusted with this presidency, but who else, right? I mean, who are you going to find like George Washington that could possibly handle this, would really step down after 4 years, things like that. So,
that was a big debate. I found it as a common thread through these was, what's the best way to protect your liberties? Is the best way to protect your liberties through a strong, powerful national government that could possibly take them away from you, or a weak national government that couldn't stop individuals or states, smaller states or communities from taking them away from you? And that's a really big argument. Can a big, powerful national government really be democratic, and maintain your individual rights and liberties?
If I may go back to the issue of human nature, when I think about sort of the tone of the Federalist Papers as I was reading the first 11, there's this indication that there's tremendous optimism as to the capacity of reason to settle these problems, right? Mm-hmm. So that we can reasonably work these differences out in conversation. But then you have this very pessimistic view of human nature. And you might think that those two are in tension with one another, but they're really not. I mean, there's a distinction. This first emerges in David Hume. a distinction between reason in its capacity to settle matters of truth and falsehood, and then the power of reason to settle issues of that are essentially sort of embodied in the passions, right? So when my own interests are at stake, then I become radically unreasonable. And reason can't settle those disputes. Reason can only settle disputes that have to do with truth and falsity. But when my interests are at stake, again, there's this sense that reason is really impoverished. And this famous quote from David Hume, reason is the slave of the passions, ultimately. But, the idea that human nature, is somehow corrupted, I mean, that goes back to Hobbes, right? And the social contract theory that emerges in Hobbes. But there are other really interesting ways of talking about social contract that are much more optimistic about human nature. And John Locke, ironically, is pretty optimistic about human nature, unlike Hobbes.
Yeah.
And then Rousseau in France, of course, is even far more optimistic than even Locke. So.
Well, in number 7, Hamilton talks about the Western lands, which was a big source of contention, was who owned that land, who did that land belong to, and he talked, if we don't have unity, if we don't have a national government, the various states or territories are going to go to war over that land. So having a national government that could be that reasoning power, and that could, help prevent a lot of this kind of stuff. We'll settle it. The national government, in these verse 11, several times they say the national government could be that reasoning force, against the various competitions that are going to exist between different states or different territories.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. It might be pretty obvious, but I wasn't completely clear on why these letters had to be anonymous.
That's a good question.
I don't know the exact answer, to be honest with you. And that's a really good question, and we'll look into that. But I don't know why. Because everybody knew who was writing them.
They did. It was clear.
It was obvious.
Okay.
I actually read a little something on that somewhere, and I guess, at least from whoever it was that wrote what I read, said that they agreed to write under the pseudonym, thank you, of Publius, was so that way it wouldn't be like, even though everybody knew it was Hamilton, Madison, and Jay writing these papers, it was more about, we're speaking for a majority of people who agree with us, so we want to say like they were speaking for the people who had already ratified it, and were like trying to be more than just their 3 opinions, trying to be the opinions of most of the country, to kind of basically put more peer pressure on those who already hadn't ratified it to ratify it. Because it always comes down to peer pressure.
And the writing under pseudonyms seems to be a pretty common practice in this time. Like the Letters from an American Farmer was by a Pennsylvania lawyer,
John
Dickinson. Yeah, and
Ben Franklin wrote under one.
Right, it was
Right.
And then some of the anti-federalist papers, one of them I read is by just an old Whig, like someone who, Whig is in W-H-I-G, an anti-monarchist. He's writing to say, don't set up this monarchy, So it seems to have been common practice, but yeah, specifically, it's an interesting thing. And Publius, I read from this, he was one of the founders of the Roman Republic. So just as they're hoping to found this new republic, they're calling on that. And the Romans were, in a lot of ways, the Roman people of the Roman Republic were heroes to a lot of the well-educated, because the men who set up this, because they set up this balanced republic. You had the assembly, which was the democracy in a sense, the male citizens of Rome voting on the laws, and then you had the Senate, which was the aristocrats and the advisory body in a sense, and then you had the consuls, the 2 consuls who were basically elected kings. And so that's something like, you can make a pretty clear analogy to what was going on here with the 3 branches of government, the checks and balances and everything that the Roman Republic had too. So there would have been some, Publius would have been a good name to use in this time, I think.
I was thinking about this a lot in class today, because we don't have the class together, and you can, like you're saying, you can apply so much of that to what we're talking about now. and I'm making so many connections because I'm in your class, I have class with you, I have an international relations class, and everything is just like this continuous circle, and it's so interesting to see, and even some of the names that you were throwing out, was it Hume and Hobbes, with all these paradigms like realism and localism and all these things that you can kind of connect with each other. It's pretty neat.
And these arguments have never left us. I mean, even after this Constitution becomes ratified, a good portion of the population just refused to accept that there would be a stronger national government. And that's, that'll be a big subject of this year's election.
Civil War is.
Well, sure, yeah. The Civil War supposedly settled it, but it didn't really settle it because, Obama, is going to go out there and say, look, a big government's going to fix this.
Well, it was like the State of the Union last night. You have half the room that basically sat on their thumbs the entire night, and the other half that was standing up and clapping all the time. And what I thought was funny was behind President Obama, you had Joe Biden, who looked like half the time he was about to break into tears because he was so happy. And then you have Bonner sitting behind him on the other side, kind of shooting daggers into the back of the president's head. And then every once in a while looking over towards his constituents on that side of the room going, is it okay to clap for this? I mean, do we agree with this? Is this something we want to... And then like a couple of times they cut to people like Eric Cantor and John McCain that just, when they cut to them, I got this image of Old Man Potter from It's a Wonderful Life in my head, just, sitting there all grumpy and frumpy in his wheelchair counting his money.
I mean, they talk about, red states, blue states, but we started that way. We started that way because you could clearly identify, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution until years later after it had been, Washington had been elected. So you could say, we were divided from the beginning, and we've never, ever really been truly unified.
If I remember correctly from your U.S. history class, it was Rhode Island that didn't even send delegates to the
Constitutional Convention. No way. Patrick Henry refused to go because he smelled a rat. So we've had that division, and maybe that's probably what's been healthy, is because we've always engaged, except for one time, civilly in the discussion of, what should be the role of national government.
Well, that's one of the things I found interesting about reading these, especially with number 11, where it's talking about commerce and having a navy. Like, they keep making this argument for you need a national government that's strong enough to kind of be a moderator between all the states to keep them from bickering, and especially number 11, where they're talking about building the Navy, where they say, like, you can get the, tar and turpentine and some of the products for building the ships from the south and the timber from here, and you need people to sail the ships from the north. Like, they lay it out in such a common sense kind of, why doesn't everybody get this kind of way that I find really amazing.
Very reminiscent of, Henry Clay and the American system.
Yeah.
That we can intertwine our economies, that will help unify us. Because they recognize right off the bat there's these differences. It was amazing. They're almost foreshadowing the Civil War. I mean, he talks about how the North could become a much stronger section than the South, and then could start to use that to its advantage.
Yeah, it's interesting. Compared to the North was Northern Europe and the South was Southern Europe. So it was sort of like Britain, France, Prussia is the North, and the South was Italy and Greece and Spain and stuff. And it's just kind of interesting how they kind of look at the laws of geography or something. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to see what kind of analysis they're applying to the country, which of course is very, very young at the time, and how they understand it. There's actually a really good article online, and I don't remember the name of it, but it's by Walter Russell Mead, and I think it's called The Age of Hamilton. Walter Russell Mead, The Age of Hamilton, where he basically argues that the whole American, the mainstream of American debate has always been between Hamilton and Jefferson. You want a strong national government that organizes the society and lifts it into something it shouldn't be, or do you distrust the federal government in sort of the Jeffersonian or maybe even the anti-federalist way? That's basically been something that's gone throughout our whole history, and so that you trace Hamilton through like Henry Clay in the American system, Lincoln, and then FDR to Great Society, Obama, things like that, and then Jefferson would be traced through like Andrew Jackson, and all the way up to, say, the Tea Party now. So it's really good, and of course the one weakness is, would Hamilton still want the federal government to keep getting stronger? But he said, well, we could kind of cross the bridge I was talking about a long time ago. But it's interesting to see those kind of two competing ideas of federal strength uplifts the nation, or federal strength crushes our liberties, and you can kind of see that developing right here. So it's a really interesting article that came out, I think, early January, late December, something like that, or late December.
That was one of the other things that got me when I was reading these. Like, you watch like political interviews with people running for, like, the Republican candidates running for office, or for basically anytime there's an election, you have these people that'll go on shows like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, shows like that, and give interviews, and they're always, oh, well, the framers said this, and the founding fathers said this. It's like, when I was reading these, I was like, I wonder if someone like Michelle Bachmann, who constantly throws that phrase, has ever actually read these, because from what they say half the time, I don't think they have.
Well, it's somewhat ironic that Tea Partiers or whatever who keep talking about getting back to the original Constitution with an idea that we don't have a government at all. And the people who wrote the Constitution and argued most vehemently for it wanted a strong national government. You know, that is a real misrepresentation. You know, in fact, I find it very interesting in Hamilton in number 9, you know, talking about how a republic would be more democratic than a democracy, because it is better to have this strong national government run by the best, most able-bodied people as a way to, you know, use the national government most effectively.
Yeah, and how he keeps kind of taking what Montesquieu said in his writings and kind of like, oh, well, you're only showing this one side of it to show how it's bad. You need to kind of, you know, show all sides. And he especially kind of shows in this paper kind of like he really very clearly kind of defines that there is that kind of Goldilocks zone where it's just right, where you have just the right amount of people representing just the right amount of people, so that way everybody's interest kind of gets counted and then it's fair.
Sure.
It's interesting to think too. I mean, I think the some of the more of the if we call them Jeffersonian or the Tea Party advocates and things like that, who have more like solid grasp of the Constitution, would argue, I guess, that the reason they don't want the expanded federal powers is because it's going beyond the enumerated powers.
Sure.
You know, and that I think is, in a sense, a huge part of it too. Is what is the relationship of the federal government to the enumerated powers? Can it do anything as long as it doesn't say the Constitution says it can't, or can we only do what it says it can? And that's a big, at least going back to what Teddy Roosevelt and stuff, right?
Well, I mean, it actually, you could say it goes back to the bank case.
Nicholas Biddle and
the one before that, not the one right with
the First Nation.
I was absent that day. The one that the argument over the second, the establishment of the First National Bank.
Right, with Hamilton's financial plan. And
when Marshall ruled that the power to tax is the power to destroy.
McCulloch versus Maryland.
Yeah, McCulloch versus Maryland, in which the Supreme Court basically ruled that at the bottom of the enumerated, Patrick, edit that part out where I forgot the court case. That in that court case, the Supreme Court said that at the end of the enumerated powers, they have the necessary and proper clause. That is, Congress has all powers necessary and proper to execute the enumerated powers. And that essentially meant they can do whatever they want as long as they can justify it within the enumerated powers. And Madison himself had insisted on that necessary and proper clause. So the father of the Constitution, who wrote the enumerated powers, knew that to box the government in like that would not be right. So he insisted on that clause. And then when the Supreme Court said, yeah, that basically means they can do pretty much whatever they want. So, to argue that the founders just meant this small little, I think the enumerated powers are 11 or 13, I think that's a bit of a bad argument by those people who are advocating this government that does nothing.
Well, it's like the same people who are in like the Occupy movement or the 99% movement or the Tea Party that want to keep running around screaming, oh, the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment. And when you ask someone if they've ever actually read it and know what it says, and if they don't, you show it to them, and all it basically says is powers not granted to the federal government and not specifically denied to the state governments shall be given to the states.
Right.
And people read it and it's like, wow, that's all it says?
Mm-hmm.
And even then you have to explain it to them because, and even after you show it to them and they read it, you still have to explain it to them 3 and 4 times before they understand it.
Well, and in number 9, Hamilton says that the states are going to play an important role in the national government because they're sending representatives, they're sending senators. So it's not like there's a national government that lords over these states. The states send the representatives to the national government.
And part of it, what I got out of it, that was that like the states are responsible for sending people to the federal government, but the state governments are also responsible for kind of trimming the fat or cutting the riffraff from a lot of the stuff that people want to complain against the government about.
Sure.
So it's like, the federal government's saying, it's like, okay, we deal with the serious stuff, you guys kind of take the appetizers, for lack of a better word.
It was kind of impressive too how even then they knew that they were going to have to leave kind of an open door to interpretation where they knew we're going to live in a different world in a couple hundred years. It's not going to be the same. Everything's going to be different. Technology, the way we do trade, international relations, all these things that are going to be different. We need to make sure that we have a way of changing how we do things and still have this foundation of why we're doing things the way we're doing it. And I thought that was really cool how they got it right, I think, and it's worked so well, and it's this great system that's unique to anyone else's with all the checks and balances, and it's kind of impressive how it's so strong.
No, I mean, just reading these just reminds me of how brilliant these people really were.
Like, I was reading these and I got the feeling it's like they knew basically what every argument could be that would be brought against them, and then they realized that times would have to change and there would be more that they couldn't comprehend now. So, like you said, it needs to be that like open window or that doorway to go through to keep expanding and changing and modifying.
Yeah, and of this first set, of course, number 10 is the most famous because one of the biggest arguments that the anti-federalists were making were that the rights of the minority would not be protected under this new, stronger national government. And I think Madison just does this great job of talking about how we are factions. Factions are natural, and you need this strong, powerful national government to protect those factions.
Well, I think they kind of got that from, at least when they were writing these, the more recent of the time European history, where you had a lot of these rulers that were trying to enforce one religion, one set of laws, and one code of conduct, basically, on people who didn't necessarily have those beliefs, but then when they tried to practice their own beliefs or whatever, they got crushed by an iron boot. So they basically kind of saw that, like it says in here, people are going to have different opinions. That's just the way human nature is, so we need to do something about that.
Although there are very obvious failures on that front, with the Mormons, for example, heavy persecution, got political.
Yeah.
There's certainly a political dimension there as well.
Right.
As the government confronted issues like polygamy,
Well, yeah, and then that raises always, the big question of, the Bill of Rights were to apply to everyone, but then what becomes freedom of religion? Is polygamy, and the Supreme Court has ruled in several instances that freedom of religion is not absolute.
Sure.
That, even there can be limits to rights, natural rights. And so, the Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution after it was ratified, I think, to better address, to make sure those things happen. But clearly, like you said, Mormons have been persecuted, African Americans have been persecuted. The gay community today would say that they're persecuted because they're not allowed to engage in marriage. So, it certainly is not perfect, but...
Well, it's the same kind of thing with the Second Amendment and all these people running around. Oh, the Second Amendment says right to bear arms. I can have any gun I want, carry it with me at all times, have any sort of ammunition that I want. They can do all sorts of nasty things to people for no reason. Just because they piss me off, I'm going to shoot them. Right. And if you read it, it says, in order to maintain a well-regulated militia, which to my mind, in today's terms, means like the National Guard and Army Reserves. So like my dad always says, you want the right to bear arms, walk around in a tank top.
Yeah.
And that's one of those key issues, because there's those two clauses, bear arms, militia.
Right.
And so does one depend on the other, or is the bear arms absolute? Does it depend on what and lately it seems to have been going, like Supreme Court generally has not wanted to extend that protection too far, except just recently you had the Washington D.C. case and everything. So it's going to be another, and it's wrapped up in the culture war issues too. So that'll be certainly an issue that keeps going on.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are people that disagree. Is that two separate statements, or is that one statement? Generally the court has agreed that it is two separate statements, but there are people who vehemently believe that was meant to be one statement. It wasn't like the improper use of punctuation, perhaps.
Mr. West, what did you think, just from the first 11, like in terms of coherence or philosophy or political theory? What was your evaluation so far of how they're doing in terms of this?
No, I thought the argumentation is pretty solid. And I think that they bring a lot of historical examples. I think they make their case very well. Each of the writers, Madison toward the end, Jay at the beginning. I thought it's pretty solid. In terms of sort of what's going on in the world at the time, I think a lot of political theorists in Europe at the time are really looking to America to see what's going to happen. How is this all going to play out? And so it is an experiment, I think, and it's a really interesting time in our history. And I think the success of that experiment is apparent. And I don't know what else to say, but I was impressed. I don't think there are any mistakes being made. I didn't see anything that was...
Well, we forget what a novel idea it is, the thought that people could govern themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, this is truly, most people still believe that most people needed to be ruled by a strong hand king or a dictator, because they just simply would fall apart. And they're making those same arguments so that the people will fall apart, but we can keep people together by a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
It is interesting because, Hobbes explicitly argues in favor of an absolute monarch to support his notion of the social contract. And, we can see that, an absolute monarch may not be the best at sort of enforcing the terms of the contract, if you understand a contract on a global scale.
Well, the argument is always if it's a benevolent one.
Right.
And, we've yet to find the benevolent dictator.
But there's a reason somebody said a long time ago, power corrupts, and they absolutely
Right.
power corrupts absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that's why they've always feared that there just can't be benevolent dictator. But in some instances, dictatorship is needed to keep people together. Like in the case of Iraq, what's kept that all together was an iron-fisted dictator, but the benevolency part was missing.
What do you think they would have felt about the UN? If they could see how that is playing out? Because I thought about that in class when you talk about, that may be the closest thing we have to any type of overseeing power. And I just wonder what they would think about it.
I think looking through the lens of 1787 to 1789 when all this was taking place, I think they would have opposed it. I think they would, they talk about, the need to have a strong Navy because they fear that, people are going to get jealous of us and try to disrupt our commerce. And I think they really liked the idea of let's just be, they were not isolationists, that's not, entirely true. They believed in getting out and trading and stuff like that, but I really felt that they feel like they had kind of this perfect system of government and it was, let's just keep it to ourselves. I think they were worried about turning sovereignty over to some kind of international body of countries that, they viewed as despotic.
Well, they kind of broached that subject in number 11 where it was talking about if you have like a loose confederation of 4 or 5 separate entities that make up the United States, that if, you try and go to like a foreign power like England or France or someplace like that to set up some sort of trade agreement, then they're not going to have the power to do that because they would be too small to really defend themselves. And like the example they gave would be like going to England, but then having to go through Belgium to get their goods because they would need basically somebody to insure it.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of made a good case for, if we all agree to use this system and adhere to the rules and guidelines as they're set up and kind of agree as we have to come up with new ones, then it makes everybody stronger and it keeps everybody safer.
As I read the sections that were assigned today, my sense was that there's a real sense of panic, actually. That was this dominant theme of panic. And if you think what's going on in the world, there's this clamoring after resources, right? And this sort of effort to, of course, I think the realization that the Americas represented this bastion of tremendous natural resources that were going to be pursued quite aggressively by other nations. And so there's this effort. We better get our act together before we have, and then, of course, there are powers at work. The British Empire, as well as France, were already here, essentially, and Spain was already in Mexico and moving up into California, Florida certainly was part of that. But yeah, I think there's a sense of panic that I was slightly uncomfortable with. But given the sort of historical implications of what was going on at the time, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and a lot of that panic also came from Shays' Rebellion, in which people of a state lost their state.
Right.
So there was really a concern that this civil disorder, this civil insurrection, was going to keep happening and was going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And a big reason, if not the entire reason for the revolution, was to protect individuals' private property. And people really began to fear, would private property be protected in future Shays' rebellions?
Right.
Would people start taking other people's stuff?
Well, I think Shays' Rebellion really kind of galvanized the founders and the framers to go, okay, we've gotten rid of England ruling us, but now there's this power vacuum. If it lasts for too long, are more of these little insurrections going to be happening? And who are they going to be going to for help? Are they going to go up into Canada and go to the British, go west and go to the French, go to the Spanish, and then you basically invite war upon yourself on all sides?
And then the big question then again comes back to what about the rights of those people who rebelled in Shays' Rebellion they felt they were rebelling against excessive taxation. How do we protect their rights? But yet, that just becomes this open-ended question that we keep wrestling with.
I'm wondering if there would be an idea about the UN too. I imagine too that they would be pretty skeptical of it. Like they see the human nature is always clashing, causing countries to clash. I should say they would probably be somewhat skeptical of the work. I imagine maybe it's hard to imagine somebody at this time, although maybe somebody like a Jefferson in his more lofty moments of really can bring us all together or something like that. But I think it would be hard for them to imagine like absolutist countries and everything all coming together. I guess something I was thinking about, and I might be connecting two loose ends that shouldn't be connected here, but it's about this time Kant was writing, right? And didn't he talk about a government for perpetual peace? Mm-hmm. So would they have had, maybe that would help us to answer the question of, would they have had similar or different assumptions from him?
Well, I think very different assumptions, particularly about philosophical anthropology. There's a very different theory of human nature at work in Kant. And so the British empiricists were typically, almost, with the exception of Locke, were almost in unison as to, the effect of human nature on social institutions. There's a very different picture, but I think that picture is sort of, it's a very short road from Kant to Hegel to Marx. It's a very different political organization that they're imagining. And, and of course Rousseau is Kant's predecessor, and Kant is admittedly indebted to Rousseau.
Okay.
It's a very different political organization they're imagining.
Okay. And would Adam Smith be a part of that British empiricist?
I think, yes.
Okay, so sort of self-interest.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So if, that makes sense. So they would be more the school of clashing interests, whereas with Rousseau and Marx and Kant, they could envision something that unified interests a lot more than they might be able to. Okay.
The perpetual peace essay that you referenced, is highly theoretical, and Kant sort of admits that he is imagining a state that is functioning, very, all of its parts are organized, and so he's imagining it's more of a theoretical piece than. He's very sort of aware of the controversies that can emerge, so he's not daft to any of those issues by any means. I think Kant is very sensible, but I think again he leans to the left, way to the left, and so it gives birth to these ideas that eventually lead to Marxist communism.
I think as far as the whole UN thing goes, if you just explain to Madison, Jay, Hamilton what it was, they'd be like, wow, you actually got everybody to sit in a room and do that? Mm-hmm. But if you actually took them there and showed them how, like a normal daily session of the General Assembly, they'd go, yeah, this is pretty much what we expected.
Well, and a lot of what they, predicted would happen, did happen. I mean, it's still been constant wars, and we had our own little civil war. So, their distrust or their worry over human nature certainly seems to have been warranted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, although in defense of the Kantian tradition, if we can call it that, I mean. There's this sense. I mean, Marx would say we haven't seen the conditions that, and capitalism, of course, is part of the problem, right? So if we can eradicate, or if the conditions emerge such that capitalism fails of its own accord, then we can see a social order emerge, and that may be unrealistic. So there's this idea that capitalism is really the problem. And greed sort of feeds self-interest rather than, so to create an adequate social order, you have to first get rid of what makes us selfish in the first place.
Well, and they allude to greed in here, as what motivates people, and that a powerful national government could check that.
Yeah. So it's basically the question is greed intrinsic or extrinsic to human nature?
Then? Yeah, right. Because greed existed far before capitalism.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I guess the idea, See, one of the ideas that's prominent in Marx's early philosophy is this idea that human nature is plastic, right? So if you change the material conditions in which human beings find themselves, human nature will also change, right? And in response to the changed conditions. And many theorists think that that's where Marx essentially went wrong.
Mark put on a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of got me when I was reading this was like when they talk about having elected representatives going to the national government, they keep alluding to them being the best and the brightest of the people who are electing them. And then that kind of got me thinking of, for what little of Marx I've read, where he talks about communism kind of creating this new, or like this new version of a person to make communism work. And for whatever reason, because my brain is wonky like that, it made that connection. So it was just one of those like stop and think moments.
Overcaught her. No, next week on Over, Federalist Papers 12 through 22.
I think we could probably, maybe the last thing we could talk about is just to look at Federalist Paper number 10 in more detail, since that's so famous. And I've always been fascinated with that one since I read it. Just for the pretty tight argumentation about, all right, here's the problem, we've got factions, we could eliminate them by destroying liberty or giving everybody the same opinion. Those aren't either not going to work or would be terrible, so we need to actually just figure out how to deal with factions. And also, after a couple times of reading it a few years ago, realized that Madison actually says democracy is bad, that's what we want to avoid, and we need a republic. You know, so that would not get him elected president today. Because you have to pay. Well, you always have to pay tribute to the idea of democracy. No matter what, because it's just ever since the 1830s or so, it's been a big part of the discourse about our elections too. But it's interesting to just think about his contrast of a republic and a democracy. And I always kind of think he's probably got Athens, the radical democracy of Athens in his background, where they in the Peloponnesian War they executed 6 out of their 10 victorious admirals because they didn't properly take care of the bodies of the dead sailors, you know. So it was a pretty raucous and wild place. And I think, on the other hand, the Republic is probably thinking about early Rome and everything. That's a very interesting argument that he makes throughout, just that a big republic, this Confederate Republic, as Hamilton calls it before, can actually water down the factions enough that it's not going to be controlled by either a small group of rich or a large group of poor to oppress the alternates. So do you guys have any thoughts about Federalist Paper number 10?
Well, I think he was proven right by the fact that when he basically says we're going to be factions, that's just unavoidable. But no one faction is ever going to be able to take over, and he's so far has been proven right. That we have always been a country that has been governed by the center. Sometimes we've been center right, sometimes center left, but we've never really had extreme radicalism of a small faction takeover. So I think he's proven right. People who worry that that the rich would take over, that really hasn't happened. Some people want to argue that, but everyone in this country, for the most part, can vote, can participate. It's more difficult if you're not rich, but if the rich were truly in charge, there'd be no income tax.
Right.
Well, a lot of people today complain about participating in government. It's like, okay, yeah, you don't necessarily have the resources, the education, the time to go out and campaign and win elected office, but you can still go and vote and say, I want this person for this job because I think they're going to be doing it. They have the capacity to do it the best, which is one of the things that bugs me when I read these polls for these Republican primaries, because people's biggest worry is, oh, I voted for this person because I think they're going to have the best chance at beating President Obama in November. It's like, if you're just voting for somebody because you think he can beat the guy in office, but you don't really give a crap about what he does after that, to me that's almost kind of wasting your vote. Like, you should kind of more look at what's important to you and what you want to be done and go that way. Which is also why I annoyed at a lot of these politicians who pander to the Tea Party and a lot of the ultra groups on either the right or the left, just because they're the ones that happen to be yelling the loudest and drawing the most attention to themselves, just because they're stomping around like a 4-year-old throwing a hissy fit.
I guess sometimes I suppose that voting for someone who can beat the guy in office would also be about, well, at least we know they're not going to do this, or whatever. But it's, and the whole idea of what you can expect from candidates is an interesting one too. You know, what can a president actually get accomplished, and what can't he or she, and what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. How important is it to get the wrong person out or the right person? It's just, yeah, the whole complex of the way voters make decisions is probably something that's been the subject of a lot of interesting studies, and also hard to study too, probably.
It would cause a lot of headaches if you tried to study that.
Yeah.
Because there would just be some things that would just not make any sort of rational sense. But then again, it's government, so you kind of have to expect that.
So the kind of factions that are primarily of concern here, are they political factions or are they religious?
He talks about all kinds of factions. He talks about religious factions and
Right.
economic factions.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, what I mean is that, you know, clearly there are economic factions, but the most predominant seem at the time are religious in nature, it would seem to me. The most sort of palpable, culturally speaking, right, would be religious factions.
Although with the Shays Rebellion and what was going on in Rhode Island, those seem to be the ones that were kind of driving the framers. So in Shays Rebellion, you had these farmers saying, you know, we're not going to lose our land. We need to, you know, shut down these courthouses so that we can't get foreclosed on. In Rhode Island, they were like manipulating the not the current. It was either the currency or the notes that were used, and saying, hey, it was the currency. We'll accept a fixed rate of currency for these things, and the creditors, of course, well, yeah, we're getting way less than it's worth. So that was part of it, you know, just in terms of like this probable tension of farmers who were deep in debt, trying to take matters into their own hands, either through the government or to oppose the government, and then so that would have been something I think that was pretty obvious, especially like you think about the tensions between like the settled or the developed cities and long settled farmlands and the frontiers. The economic tensions in each state would have been something that was obvious, but also certainly the religious aspects.
I don't know if they ever feared religion as much as it was economic. They just. I think they just were. Shays Rebellion just really shook them to the core that what they viewed as a legitimate government, a government elected by the people, was being ignored by another group of people. I mean, Sam Adams went so far as to say anyone that rebels against a republic was treasonous, because to them it was no big deal to rebel against a king whom they had not elected. But to rebel against elected officials, that was really what scared them, because they thought, okay, once we elect our own representatives, we'll never have another problem again. Because the people's representatives are the people's representatives, so whatever they do is what the people want. Well, they found out it's not always what the people want. So I think they more feared the economic factions than the religious factions. Now that stuff comes later with, well after the Constitution, when the Irish Catholics start.
Right.
That's really when fear of religion really becomes much more.
Well, you have a monolith, they can vote as a body,
Right.
and that becomes, So I guess that develops much later.
I'm trying to think this was following the revolution not following too long after the Great Awakening, and in some ways that had fractured a lot of the established denominations and created the various evangelical groups and shattered the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, and created the separate Baptists and all sorts of groups. So I don't know if that, in a sense, took some of the pressure off of the church-state combination that, or what? And also then there's been the sort of a dip in the public piety after the revolution too. So I'm not sure if that was something that the revolution sort of brought people of different denomination, sects together, and then, because but he does talk a little bit about religious.
Yeah. You certainly mentioned, but it's certainly on your mind.
It's not didn't seem to be at the forefront. I don't know if that was because freedom of religion, in a fairly limited way, had been sort of established, or what. But
I think part of that was due to the fact that a good portion of those considered the founding fathers and framers of the Constitution were or at least proclaimed to be deists, where they just said everything, but he's not here anymore. We kind of have to take it upon ourselves to make sure that society works. So I would think they maybe thought that, if we just kind of let people believe what they want to believe, as long as it's not really hurting anybody else, then that's one less thing we really have to deal with, and we can concentrate on taking care of things that really do need our attention, like social issues, the economy, national expansion, and that kind of thing.
All right, Scott, wrap us up.
yeah, so I was just thinking. Well, we are going to wrap up for today. For next Wednesday, February 1st, we're going to talk about Federalist Papers 12 through 22, and then we'll have a couple-week break and come back on the 15th for, I believe, 23 through 33. So thanks very much for joining us today. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you later.